Hello, my name is Mary Gray, and I'm a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research. I use she, her pronouns, and I study the everyday uses of technology, particularly among people who have limited or marginalized access to it. Today, we're presenting a panel presentation on community-driven research with an emerging scholar spotlight. So it's my pleasure to have a panel that's focused on these emerging scholars you're going to hear from today who are linked to Microsoft Research through internships and fellowship programs. They're bringing their work on community-driven approaches to areas of innovation, featuring everything from collective action and grassroots innovation among taxi drivers in Jakarta to work on health education among transgender youth, to studies of pronouns in the workplace and how that connects to the questions of social movement, opportunities, and constraints around the world. So each of our panelists will talk about their research questions and specifically how their work informs, challenges, and hopefully advances our understanding of the relationship between technologies and society. And specifically, how does community engagement fit into the work that they do? What difference does it make that they're talking with communities? And also, is there a burning question that they'd like to offer us to think with today? So our first speaker will be Rida Qadri. She's currently a PhD candidate in the Urban Information Systems program at MIT. Her research seeks to uncover the myriad ways in which human labor and informal relationships sustain digital technologies, particularly in the global South. She's exploring the limits of the efficiency of algorithmic mediation in non-Western contexts, and she's hoping to contribute to more inclusive technological artifacts. Rida, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Mary. It's wonderful to be here. Since Mary already gave a little bit of an introduction, I won't get into too much detail about the background of my research. Broadly speaking, I look at mobility platforms in non-Western spaces, specifically examining the kinds of driver relationships, social infrastructure, and optimizations that underpin platform technologies in a non-Western city like Jakarta, Indonesia. My research, I think, challenges the way we think about technological development currently in three key ways. One, I think that there's an assumption that its technologies, once they're developed and implemented, are going to be drivers of change. In my research, I actually find that it's the social relationships that drivers in Jakarta have built around these mobility platforms that become the infrastructure through which mobility platforms enact their or realize the promised efficiencies and the removal of friction that was assumed to be a feature of the mobility platform. Specifically, these grassroots community relationships mediate a lot of the algorithmic failures that arise in Jakarta because of inappropriate technology design. So as an example, when a mobility platform is matching a driver to a customer, it doesn't understand that in Jakarta, there will always be blockades in roads where drivers will not be able to reach a customer through a particular route. That's not reflected in Google Maps. And there are city spaces that are dangerous and drivers cannot enter, either because of fear of being robbed or because of pre-existing informal arrangements that have spatially divided up the city amongst different groups. So drivers end up using their own information networks, their own community emergency response systems, their own informal parking arrangements, their own routing help systems and these kinds of group relationships to facilitate their work and make the technologies efficient. So that's one thing. The other thing that comes out of this is that the impact of technologies is extremely contextually driven. So platform work, and I would say generally the future of work, is not just dependent on globalizing technologies, but it's deeply shaped by the context, the labor histories, the cultural relationships of the spaces within which technologies are entering. So the ways in which drivers in Jakarta are navigating this kind of quote-unquote new digitally mediated form of work is a direct result of the kinds of cultures of mutual aid, pre-existing market organization, the spread of communication technologies like WhatsApp that have existed in Jakarta even before these mobility platforms entered. And so it's both the result, the form of work platform work looks like right now in Jakarta is not just a representation of the mobility platform, but is a representation of the interaction of these kinds of changes that have opportunities that mobility platforms have created in conjunction with the kinds of pre-existing histories of Jakarta. And this kind of both of these points merge to create kind of a commentary on the future of work, where we realize that there is no one singular future of work that we can look at divorced from the communities within who are actually doing or experiencing this work. And this future will not be equally experienced by workers around the world. And examining these relationships that platform workers in Jakarta have crafted show how diffuse and divergent this future will be, where neither the worker behavior or company strategies remain static as these technologies expand globally. And I think the other thing that these 2 points remind us is that work is always going to be communal. The frictions and the changes and transformations that people experience are going to be mediated through these community relationships. And when I mean community, I also mean that we need to populate this term of community with the people who have their own frameworks, incentives, impulses in when they interact with technology. So my burning question is, how do we, as in spaces like Microsoft, learn from and understand the relationships that mediate these dreams of the futures of work? How can we learn from these relationships and support them as opposed to trying to automate them out? And how do we develop technologies that augment and facilitate these pre-existing infrastructural relationships? And here I also want to give a quick shout out to really excellent work that's being done by Jackie O'Neill's team in Mari, who's looking at these kinds of social relational infrastructures that allow remote work to continue. So my question is, leading off of these kinds of research, how do we then build technologies that respond to these relationships as opposed to trying to automate them out?
That's a great question. Thank you, Rida. And definitely pointing to Jackie O'Neill's work is a fantastic place to take our discussion. Our next speaker is Calvin Liang, who's a third-year PhD student in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at University of Washington. His research explores the intersections of queerness, health, and technology by examining how to design technological innovations and interventions that support LGBTQ people with their health and challenge normative values and practices in health more broadly. Calvin?
Thank you, Mary, and good morning. Thank you so much. I'm Calvin Liang. I use he, they pronouns. And as Mary sort of alluded to, my research brings together queerness, health, and technology to inform how we might design and implement critical health interventions for marginalized people, but specifically LGBTIA2S plus people. Today, I'm going to be talking about sort of 2 projects. The first one is my dissertation work, in which we are trying to design and develop sex education resources for trans and gender expansive youth. And then the second project is what I've been doing with Microsoft, in which we are trying to understand technology needs of community health workers in North Carolina who work with community-based organizations. Excuse me. And sort of across both of these projects, partnering with the actual people that we are designing for is absolutely integral to our process. And, excuse me, I'm going to drink some water. Sorry, as I was saying. So I work with communities who have historically been marginalized and just have a pretty bad relationship with the healthcare system, and for good reason. And to sort of account for that, it requires a lot of extra care that goes into the work that we do. A lot of being intentional about our involvement as researchers and designers and engineers. And a lot of that for me sort of focuses on reflexivity and understanding my personal sort of limits and strengths as I sort of move forward in the work. And so I think that my work sort of challenges notions of normativity, neutrality in how we design and do engineering work, and really sort of draws out the assumptions and biases that each of us carry as we sort of do research. Specifically, primarily in the context of health, there are a lot of normative practices that end up being really, really harmful to folks who are marginalized in society. And so it's important to sort of recognize the ways that we ourselves are reinforcing those norms and how we might sort of resist and challenge sort of the status quo, right? I think my work also my work also challenges the idea that technology is this panacea of all the problems that we're seeing. For example, with my work with the sex ed resources, there is an awareness that there's this greater level of discrimination and oppression that trans youth kind of face, and that the technology that we're developing isn't going to solve that, right? That's not going to erase the problem altogether. And so part of what's really important of our process is that, we're not going to fix it, right? But there's still value in doing this work. There's value in this process, and there's less emphasis placed on the destination. So I think I'm sort of starting to ramble, but I'll kind of conclude and just say that partnerships with communities is absolutely essential to this work, and it actually really enriches it in a lot of different ways, both for me personally and I think as we produce knowledge and think about society and technology. My burning question kind of goes back to this idea of reflexivity, and without sort of pressure to disclose parts of your identity, kind of thinking about, did you ever kind of question whether you were the right person to do the work that you're doing? And how did you sort of think through that? Because that's certainly been a burning question in my head for a bit. Thank you.
Oh, that's such a good question, Calvin, and I appreciate it. I feel like it's going to bring us back to a conversation about reflexivity. Thank you. So our next two speakers, and I'll introduce them together because they're going to begin with a co-presentation, is Ben Ale-Ebrahim, who is writing his dissertation exploring the relationships between social media platform policies and the development of LGBTQ social movements in the Middle East and North Africa. He will be working remotely over the summer, as he did this summer, on his doctoral dissertation in social anthropology at Indiana University, Bloomington. And Tristan Gohring, who's a PhD candidate in informatics at Indiana University. Their doctoral research sits at the intersecting fields of science and technology studies, social informatics, and gender studies. And their primary research is also about gender, but specifically about classification systems and how gender classification gets used and embedded in technologies, such as identification documents and other forms of profile pages. So let me hand it over to Tristan and Ben.
Hi, I'm Tristan. I use they, them pronouns. Ben, do you want to introduce yourself real fast?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Mary. I'm Ben. I use he, him pronouns. I'm really excited to talk about our research today.
Yeah, so we're going to primarily today share with you some research from our virtual pronoun sharing project that we worked on this summer at Microsoft. So to get us all on the same sort of level, we wanted to first discuss what pronouns are and why we're talking about them. So pronouns are a part of speech that replace nouns in a sentence. For example, instead of saying Tristan walked to the store, we could say instead replace the noun Tristan with a pronoun and say they walked to the store. In English, common pronouns include they, she, and he, although there are others.
And besides, indexing gender as they do in English, pronouns can also index many other social factors, including relationship with and between speakers, levels of politeness. And this is especially true when we think globally and across different linguistic contexts in communication. So to give a couple of examples, in English, in French, in Arabic, in many languages, pronouns are a major way where gender is referenced. The gender of a person is referenced in day-to-day conversations, whereas in other languages, for example, Turkish or Indonesian or spoken Mandarin Chinese, pronouns do not index the gender of the person that you're referring to. So in designing software for pronoun sharing, we have to really think carefully about, okay, what does it mean to release this feature in a context where gender might not index the same things as it does in an English-speaking environment.
Yeah. So many social media platforms already have tools for helping people share their pronouns. But when thinking about sharing pronouns in workplace environments via email platforms or things like that, we wanted to ask, how should we introduce software for sharing pronouns at work and at school in a responsible way, which will, one, help people communicate respectfully in diverse, multilingual, and global environments, and two, protect the needs and safety of specifically transgender and non-binary people.
So in our research this summer with Microsoft, we used qualitative methods to get some answers to these questions. We conducted over 70 in-depth qualitative interviews from a broad range of people around the world, different sizes of employers, schools, as well as large multinational companies, locations in many different countries around the world, in North America, in Europe, in North Africa primarily. And we spoke with participants for roughly an hour to an hour and a half, asking them open-ended questions about their work environment, how they use pronouns, and their experiences discussing pronouns at work.
One of our main research findings that we wanted to share today was that any kind of software for helping people share pronouns should empower people to make their own decisions about how, when, where, and with whom they share their pronouns. Pronoun sharing is an ongoing social process rather than like a one-time decision that you share your pronouns and then everybody somehow magically knows them. So as people move across different social environments, they might use different pronouns or make different strategic decisions about sharing their pronouns out of concern for their safety and security. So I think similarly to some of the themes that we heard from Rida and Calvin, we really think that software should help facilitate this process, this social process, rather than attempt to replace it.
Yeah, and just to give one brief example to really illustrate the importance of these concerns, I want to share a quote from one of the people that we talked to. We're calling them Senna. And Senna is a trans non-binary person who works at a software company in the US. So I'll just share the quote with you. Senna tells us, "I don't know who my future managers are going to be and whether I would regret it, sharing pronouns. I don't want that on record for them to see. I wouldn't want my pronouns in a place digitally that is persistent. I don't necessarily get to choose my manager because there's reorganizations, I could get moved somewhere else, and so I might end up with someone who's not accepting and who's going to discriminate against me." So Senna, like many of our participants in this quote, we can see this, Senna shared with us the importance of the individual controlling who specifically they share pronouns with and how their pronouns might be seen, especially outside moments where they're actively communicating with someone. So there were many people who were concerned about how is this information stored, how does it move across different communicative contexts. So one of the major conclusions that we came to as a result of this research is that granular audience and visibility controls in pronoun sharing software at work are a really crucial way to enable people to share pronouns and also maintain their safety and security. Their safety at school, we talked to a lot of students, as well as their job security at work.
Ben, do you want to share your burning question?
Sure, yeah. So I can share a question. I did want to talk a little bit about my own research too. So maybe before I share my question, I can just briefly discuss that. So my dissertation research is related to the project I worked on this summer with Tristan and Mary here at Microsoft. I am really interested in how social media platforms are shaping and affecting LGBT community activism in North Africa and the Middle East, and trying to understand how people are creating meaning through these platforms. And so one of the things that I've been seeing in my research is that platforms really play a critical role in LGBT expression, including in jurisdictions where LGBTQ expression is criminalized, such as Morocco, where I do most of my research. So I think many companies are not quite sure what to do in a situation like this, right? Like, what is the best approach? Do you make an LGBT software feature available in a region where LGBT expression is criminalized? This is a major question that I have in my research. And I think I can say at this point, based on my conversations and interviews with people, is that just deciding not to make it available is not always a safe and best option. A better option is instead to invest in locally tailored and proactive safety features and policies that are developed in conversation with local activists and LGBT advocates to really, understand, okay, what is the situation on the ground? What do people really need? What do they want? Because not making a feature or a platform available can actually have some serious negative effects. In an interview this summer with an activist based in Morocco about the Pronouns project, they told me one thing that I want to share with you all, and that is that they really encouraged Microsoft to develop this feature for Arabic in particular, as well as other languages globally and not just English, because they told me this kind of software infrastructure can play a really important role in destigmatizing conversations about LGBT identities, especially trans and non-binary identities. So it can play a really important role, and even if it's difficult, doesn't mean it's not something that should be done, right? So that leads me to my question. Technical features for LGBTQ expression cannot replace broader socio-cultural and linguistic shifts around LGBTQ inclusion, yet tech can be a powerful tool for destigmatizing queer expression around the world. So I just want to think through, what are the most impactful points of intervention and avenues for collaboration between designers and LGBTQ advocates in places in the global south, especially places like Morocco. Have you seen any best practices or things that have worked well? This is a question that I have. Tristan, what about you?
Yeah, so I will also take a minute to share about my dissertation research, which, as Mary said, is also about gender, and specifically gender as a way of categorizing people. And so I ask what work goes into making that system of categorization work and maintaining that system. And I'm specifically looking at identification documents like birth certificates and driver's licenses. And traditionally, those documents and the databases that hold the information on those documents have assumed that somebody's gender is something that remains static throughout a person's life. But we know now that that is not always the case. We really have known this for a while, but it is becoming more and more apparent socially that often people change their gender identity for various reasons and want to change the marker on their gender marker on their documents to align with their gender presentation or identity. And so I look at, how do people navigate systems? How are people creating systems to be able to change their identification documents? And then how do people navigate those systems to try to change their gender marker? And what I've found is that even in states in the United States where the state government has really tried to create an easy process to change one's gender marker on their birth certificate or driver's license, the process is incredibly Byzantine and very difficult to navigate. There are lots of forms that are very confusing. State websites don't provide clear information. Often the places where you have to go to submit documentation are inaccessible or are only open 10 or 15 hours a week. And so, yeah, I think that the question that I wanted to ask from this and also from our pronouns work is, how can we measure success for a product or an information system that is, designed to help marginalized communities? I'm thinking specifically about trans folks, but we could ask this question about technology that's supposed to help any kind of marginalized community. And are there maybe non-traditional measures of success that we could think about for how we know whether our technology is helping or causing more harm? So yeah, and I know we both wanted to thank Mary and our other mentor at Microsoft, Margreta Savrait, in the FAST team. It's just been a tremendous pleasure to work this summer at Microsoft. So Mary, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Tristan, and thanks all of you for your presentations to tee us up for a conversation. With the time we have left, I actually want to go to a question that Calvin raised as a way of leading us into the other burning questions that you've put on the table. So, Calvin, you raised this question about how do you evaluate whether you as the researcher are perhaps the right person for the job? And I thought that was such a poignant place to start, because it's one of those pressing questions that for many of us, we can see plenty of problems, and often our impulse is to jump in and help. And let me just start with you and ask you, first of all, when you use the term reflexivity, what do you mean by that term? And I wonder if you could kick us off and then maybe popcorn it to another person on the panel for thinking about what it means to reflect on your role as a researcher and your qualifications, your cultural literacy, if you will, to ask the questions that you ask.
Sure. Thank you, Mary. So my understanding of reflexivity and a kind of related term around positionality are that reflexivity really asks sort of who are you, right? Who are you in your identities and your experiences, your backgrounds, your biases, your values, all sorts of things. And then positionality asks who are you in relation to others, right? And so how do all those things kind of compare and how do they sort of form and reform as you interact with other people? I think in regards to your question, I've often struggled with this because I knew that there was a lot of importance placed on partnerships with communities, and so that sort of caused me to question, like, why am I here, right? So if I'm drawing on the expertise and knowledge of these trans youth or these community health workers, what's my purpose, right? And the way I've sort of, I guess, found my way around that question is that it's for me, I think about like assets, right? Like who is bringing what to the table? And if I can sort of identify that I'm here as like a researcher who brings methods, expertise, and I can't claim to know the life experiences of the people I'm working with, I think those are good boundaries as I sort of move forward in my research. And so I think I answered your question, but I'm going to popcorn it to Rida.
Thanks, Calvin. It's a hard question. Can everyone hear me? Okay. It's a hard question because I was very consciously doing research in a context that was not mine. I had never been to Jakarta or Indonesia before I started doing this research. And I have a couple of reasons for that. Sometimes your positionality in your own home context actually makes it harder to do research with communities because there's a lot of cultural, ethnic, class, gender baggage that you come with as a researcher, and those interactions become harder. And so I actually felt that I shared a lot of those, my ambiguity. People were not able to place me in Jakarta because my sort of, I was a brown woman who was also Muslim, but I was also from the US, but I wasn't white. I also kind of understood their cultural context because of similarities with Pakistan. So there's, identities are so multi-layered, and I think I'll use the terminology that Calvin used about assets. And I think you constantly have to think about how your multi-layered identities and competencies are interacting with those you're engaging with, where are they hurdles and where are they enabling. And I think the other thing to remember is that research, at least for me, is never this individual endeavor. When I entered Jakarta, I made sure that I assembled a team of just incredibly talented, grounded research assistants who had a lot of experience with engaging with communities of the drivers that I wanted to speak to, either because they were actually part of those communities. So, some of my research assistants were daughters or sisters of motorbike-taxi drivers, or because they had done extensive work in those spaces. So even when we talk about context and cultural literacy, I interviewed a lot of research assistants who were from Jakarta and had lived there in their entire life, but had never interacted with a motorbike taxi driver in their life. So, when we think about positionality and being reflexive, it's important to not just say, okay, I am Indonesian, hence, or a Pakistani, hence I can do research in Pakistan, or this person is Indonesian, hence they can do, or Jakartan, hence they can do research in Jakarta. You have to really think about what their life experiences are and what are the value systems that they bring to the table. And very briefly, the third part I would say is methodologies and methodological choices are extremely important in this case. So for me, entering these community spaces, one was easier because they were just very, very, very visible, very open, very engaging, but also in thinking about how to approach them, how to talk to them, how to have them be involved, I really let them each community, and when I say community, I don't want to generalize, like each group of people that I talked to will really lead the way in terms of setting the tone for the conversation and the questions, and constantly take advice and let my wonderful research assistants help me in that process. So it wasn't perfect, and I'm sure I will get a lot of flack for entering a context which was definitely not mine. But what does it mean to have your own context is also just a question that I really struggle with. So that, doesn't really answer questions, raises more questions, but that's how I've thought about my own research. And I can popcorn it over to Tristan.
Sure. Yeah, this is a question that I think about a lot as well. I identify as queer and trans, and that gives me a certain a certain connection and rapport with a lot of my participants, and which can help me, but also I'm always very wary of, because I also want to make sure that my participants really do consent and really understand what it is that they are agreeing to when they participate in my research. And I sometimes worry that being a community insider might serve as a shortcut for me in a way that is problematic. But also, I am, while I am queer and trans and disabled, I am also white and American. And so, I don't know that I obviously don't have the perspective of all trans people, right? That's why I do research with other people to get their own perspectives. I think that this positionality question is really always tricky for me because I I don't always this is a hard thing to say, but I don't always want people who are not part of my community to come do research on me or in my community. I don't always have a lot of trust that people walking into my community really bring the respect and understanding of some of the challenges. And so, I always, as a researcher, then want to be cognizant of like, what communities am I walking into? Am I bringing, regardless of my identities, am I bringing the understanding and respect necessary to do that group of people justice, and to, again, always help rather than hurt with my research. So Ben, I'll pass this question off to you.
Thank you. Um, yeah, like everyone else, this is something I also think about a lot. And I guess how I can add to the conversation now, I do most of my research in Morocco, but I'm also starting the beginning of a new project here in the U.S. So my identity as a gay and queer cisgender Iranian American man, kind of functions or allows me to, affects my relationships that I'm able to have in these two contexts in different ways. And I'm still kind of working through that currently with the U.S. project, especially. But like Rida was talking about, I think in Morocco, coming in as a researcher who does have some level of familiarity with what it means to be a person who is queer and a person who is Muslim or from a like Middle East, North African, family background, that does allow me to have some measure of rapport with people. And yet I am also very careful and conscious of the fact that, yes, I'm an American, I'm working on my PhD, I'm only there for a short amount of time. I think the privilege of like moving and traveling across borders, as a queer person, is something that I have, that many of the people that I work with in Morocco don't have and desperately want, to live in the U.S., for example. So, that certainly affects the relationships I'm able to have with people. So I think what I've been thinking through and the approach that I would like to have moving forward is to serve as, an advocate, someone who can be a collaborator. I think, again, going to what Calvin was saying, what can we bring to the table? I can bring my voice, my training in anthropology, my research methods, my methodology, my access to spaces like this here at Microsoft and at the university, to be an advocate for the concerns and interests and needs of queer people in Morocco. So yeah, that's how I'm thinking about it. But this is definitely something that I'm currently working through and always probably will be working through. So it's great to hear your thoughts on it too.
I wanted to start there because I feel like with each of your projects, what you're describing is what I've been kind of working through. I would call it's a kind of domain expertise. And a number of you mentioned the notion of having rapport and in some ways using that in the best sense of the word as part of your methodology for engagement and collaboration. But it feels like what I'm hearing you say is there's this domain expertise you bring because of the perspectives that you have that, again, are based on how you're reflecting on your own positionality, as Calvin pointed out, and to Rida's point, an awareness of the multi-layeredness of your identities. And that's part of what it sounds like you're incorporating into your methodology. So I want to combine a couple of your burning questions and ask you if you've thought about what are those points of collaboration, as Ben was asking, where you've been developing best practices in your own work, and how using your domain expertise as a practice within engaging communities, how you've been able to use that to be able to identify ways to learn from community relationships, either places that perhaps communities have said, you're not one of us, and what you learned from that pushback, and how you might think about what you can bring to the process of innovation, or maybe just how your domain expertise and access has been able to shed light on a particular community relationship in your research. Let me start with Rida on that question of just like how are you using your domain expertise to understand community relationships?
Domain expertise is also so tricky because I'm like not sure what that means in the context of these engagements, because I would really say that, at this point I was sort of approaching the drivers as the experts, but the lens that I was bringing in was very consciously looking at the platform through the eyes of the driver. And that was a very conscious methodological choice that I made. And I know how different the results were because I also did a stint as a data scientist in a large ride-hailing platform. And so I also sort of have experience of seeing the driver as the platform sees the driver. And the differences in terms of what became visible, what was invisible, what I was able to understand about drivers in both methodological frameworks was just kind of like night and day. And I'm not saying sort of one is necessarily superior to the other, but they were just so different. And I think being cognizant of that difference and the biases that each of your methodological choices brings, it was very important to me. So I chose to see the platform from the eyes of the drivers because I wanted to see how those drivers were engaging with and understanding specific algorithmic failures that were arising through the design of the technology or through the implementation of the functioning of the technology. And to that end, I made sure that I didn't just observe drivers in an isolated one-on-one setting where I'm sort of just talking to them in an interview, but I went to their place, the quote-unquote place of work, which for in Jakarta was these like kind of community base camps and hangout groups that drivers had made. And that really kind of showed me how social this kind of platform work is in Jakarta. When I imagine that even my choice of, doing ethnography or interviews or more like kind of deep, engaged, qualitative work my results would have been very different if I had like individually picked out drivers and kind of brought them to a cafe and said, okay, like how is work for you? Again, I'm not saying that those answers would have been incorrect. I think they would have just been different. The flip side to that is that because I was consciously in a social setting when I was interviewing and talking to drivers and observing drivers and kind of observing both their verbal and non-verbal engagements with each other and with the platform, I got kind of a much more, I wasn't as aware of the intra-group differences in opinions and engagements and expertise of these drivers as I would have been if I had sort of picked each one of them out individually. So the way it works in Jakarta is, you have this group and usually the more experienced drivers or the more senior drivers are usually the ones who sort of take the lead in answering those questions. And again, something that I had to be cognizant of. But because I kind of wanted to understand these social relationships, I went to these sites of social engagement, to the anniversary parties, to the weddings, to the emergency response mutual aid drives, where everything was happening in the collective. So that kind of, as long as you're conscious about the visions and the lens that you have adopted and the limitations of your windows, I think, there are many different points of intervention that many different ways of understanding and unpacking community engagement with technologies. This is just the one that I chose, but I'm sure other people have different opinions on what works better.
So I'm hearing us, in some ways, you become this domain expert, able to identify different kinds of subject matter expertise that you really want to be able to bring to your analysis of where are community relationships really shaping how technologies are taken up or are not taken up? Are there other folks on the panel who want to just speak to what are some other best practices that you see that help you draw the value out of studying communities closely and understanding those range of relationships that are maybe hard for us to see when we're just studying from a distance from maybe that data science lens?
I can jump in for here. I think that um, one of the things that I try to do is when for example, when I work with a community organization, um, I don't come in and say like, this is how I'm going to do research with you. I ask them like, oh, I'd like to do research with you. Um, how can we do research that would be, comfortable and appropriate with members of your community? How do we want to handle, we talk together about how we want to handle talking with community members about my research and how they might want to consent to me, say observing a meeting or something like that. That way, first of all, that's part of my process of making sure that my research is ethical, but also I think that the people who work a lot with a community group, they're the ones who know what the norms are in that group, who know what how people are going to feel when an outsider walks in. And just how things operate in that community. And so doing the planning with as early as possible in the process, planning with community leaders or community members, I think can really help get the best insights, because they can help me understand oh, given their organization or group or particular norms, what are the best ways to come in and become a temporary part of that community. So I think that for me, always involving the people who we're studying, not only as objects of study, but involving them as subjects and part of the process as early as possible is always for me how I want to be approaching that domain expertise that we're asking about.
No, that's a fantastic best practice to put on the table, that really listening to what are the agendas of the communities that we're engaging becomes a really insightful way to shape our research questions. I know we're running tight on time, so I wanted to ask a question, and I'll leave it to Ben and Calvin if you wanted to perhaps chime in relation to the last question. But I didn't want to end our conversation without thinking about the burning question of how do we measure success? Because it feels like, many of us are familiar with projects measuring success around technological innovation based on downloads, or did it scale? How many people are using something? And I would really love to hear your reflections on what would be other ways of measuring success and what measurement might even entail when it comes to working with marginalized groups. And maybe we could start with Ben, because I think you're raising that question of activists in other places who may be waiting or perhaps deliberating about adopting a particular technology. So that means adoption rates don't tell us much. What are your thoughts all on how to measure success?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think I want to address both of those questions at the same time, as far as what is a best practice that I think is a good thing to do moving forward, and also measuring success because they're related to me. So I would say, to your point of working with activist groups, advocacy groups, LGBTQ advocates in Morocco, where LGBTQ expression is criminalized. I think it's very important for technology designers, developers, companies, platforms to have open lines of communication as early as possible and on an ongoing, nature, so that technologies can always be constantly updated as norms evolve, as language evolves. So for example, this summer with the pronouns project, one of the questions we had was, if we're going to release a piece of software that's going to allow people to share pronouns globally around the world, what options should they have, and what options are out there in other languages, including Arabic? So when I was talking to activists on the ground in places like Morocco and Tunisia, they were telling me that this is an active part of their work currently, is developing pronouns that are non-binary, or that allow more space for non-binary expression in the Arabic language. That was a very important part of their activist goals of creating ways for communication for people to express themselves in a way that feels authentic to their identities as Tunisians or Moroccans or Arabs, and yet also as someone who is queer or non-binary. And so we were able to have those conversations and bring those insights to the development of this feature at a very early stage, because we were having and talking with these activists who were doing the work on the ground. So I think this is the kind of thing that needs to be happening. And the measure of success in this kind of moment is not how many people are using it or how many clicks or downloads. I think the measure of success really needs to be, is it maintaining people's safety? Is it empowering them to, do the things that they want to do as far as, in this case, activist goals of creating more space for LGBTQ people in Tunisian or Moroccan society. So I think the measure of success for me has got to be, is it keeping people safe? Is it keeping them healthy? Is it allowing them to achieve their goals? And then the question becomes, how do you measure that? Which I'm not sure. But I think, again, having those ongoing relationships and points of communication between developers and communities is the way to go forward.
Calvin, can I ask you to pick up the mic and just share your thoughts on how to measure success among marginalized communities engaging technologies?
Absolutely. I'll maybe first say that, given the sort of complexity of marginalization and even like the idea of a community, it's important to say that a metric of success is sort of a moving target, and that depends on the context and who you are as a researcher and what you're bringing. And so I've been trying to think of like a pretty way of giving this answer, but I wrote down a couple of questions that I sort of think about, which is, are my participants happier now than compared to before I came into the picture? Have I made things worse, right? And then sort of, is this meeting a need that actually exists? And it's not something that I've kind of created myself. But I kind of want to return to my original point, and something that I've been picking up on throughout everyone's kind of conversations is that community is sort of like a misleading term in that it implies uniformity. And so I think not everything is going to work for this, in the same way as we expect. And so kind of really drawing upon community-based sort of values, can you kind of construct metrics of success with the people that you're working with, and in kind of conversation with them, kind of isolate or identify things to work towards, right? And I think that's a way to really sort of touch on justice in how we do research and engineering.
Yeah. So we only have 5 minutes left, and I want to ask the hardest question at the end, of course, and no one has to answer this, but I'm wondering, as you reflect on your experience doing your research here at Microsoft Research in an industry-based lab that is arguably somewhat different than other industry-based labs, but nonetheless is not an academic setting. All of you are in academic settings that give you hopefully complete freedom to do community-driven work. What are your thoughts on this question of how we would learn from these communities and engage communities in a setting like Microsoft? What are the possibilities and what are the challenges?
I can say something here. So one thing that I think is a challenge is ensuring that the information that we or that communities share with us through this kind of research is really compensated for appropriately. And if there's ways to build, as part of these longer term collaborations, can we actually hire activists as consultants on this work, or build in networks of financial compensation at a deeper level, more extensive level than what is current practice of sending people a small amount of money for their time during an interview. How do we really value the intellectual property of the people that we work with? This is a question that I had from a group this summer, and we talked about it. And I think it's something that we need to think about moving forward too. How can we really pay and compensate and get people really they're invested, right? Like, how do we invest in these communities, these community organizations, and value their contributions?
Rida, Tristan?
I'd love to just add very quickly that I think one of the, it's great to be able to work with a product group who are actually building products. That's a great resource that we don't always have in academic settings. But I think the challenge that comes along with that is do we have the ability to say no? No, a product should not be built, or a product should not be released this way. And I think that is a challenge in a non-academic setting, to be able to say to leaders of a company no, we have, based on the research, decided that this would hurt the community more than it helps, and so we should just not do it. Yeah.
Rida?
Very quickly, I know we're almost out of time. I would say, for me, in addition to what Ben and Tristan said, is this question of iteration and what happens after you ship the product. Are you kind of the two-way communication where there is enough space to address some of the harms that are being caused, multifarious harms to a myriad, to different kinds of communities and groups, and to then kind of make amends and make changes? Is there openness and space to do that?
Calvin?
I'm not quite sure we have enough time, but just asking this question of what is needed versus what is doable, and really thinking about that as we make decisions.
Okay. Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to get some time with you all. We definitely miss you around here at Microsoft Research, and so it's always a joy to be able to have you come back and talk about your research. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing where your research takes us next.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Mary. Thanks, everyone.